Tonight, we're joined by Professor Marguerite La Caze from UQ's School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry. Marguerite's research interests include European and feminist philosophy, moral psychology, and the relationship between philosophy and film, which is the topic of tonight's discussion. She's published extensively on these topics, and her latest books include a co-edited volume with Daniel Brennan called Hannah Arendt and a History of Thought, published by Lexington Books in 2022, and a co-edited volume with Ted Nanicelli called Truth in Visual Media, Aesthetics, Ethics, and Politics, published in 2021 by Edinburgh University Press, which we discussed actually now 4 years ago in this series. And we'll be talking about truth again tonight, so it's still relevant.
Sure.
So welcome back, Marguerite.
Oh, thanks very much, Cormac, for inviting me.
A word on the format for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Usually I'm joined by Professor Roland Bleiker, who is currently in Quebec, selling tractors and also engaging in professional activities as well. It's 3 a.m. there, and he said he might join, but he hasn't joined yet, and I think he might not join. So, but he'll be chairing the next event, which I'll talk about at the end of this session. The format, like every week, starts with 30 minutes, 30 minutes of discussion between myself and the guest, where we'll have an interview-style discussion about the book. And then the second half of the session will be a Q&A with the audience online and in the room. So during the first half hour, have a think about whatever kind of questions come up. And then the second half will be talking about those. At the end, we'll be heading to St. Lucy's for some drinks. Those of us in the room, you're all invited to join to continue the discussion with our guest tonight, if she's willing to keep talking about the work. Otherwise, we can talk about other stuff as well. But yeah, so I think without any further ado, we'll jump into it. And I think the first question, which is the sort of first question that is always asked about a book, is, how did it come to be? So your book's about film and everyday resistance. In it, you discuss 6 different films, which we can sort of talk about how they portray, but also how they enact resistance as films. So before we talk about this content, I'd love to hear about where your interest in film came from, everyday resistance, how these things came together, and where this book came from.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. I was telling Cormac that was the hardest question of all. But sort of thinking about it, I've always been interested in the emotions, so that's one aspect of it. So, and my early work was about emotions and fiction. I was really interested in how fictions have the capacity to sort of evoke emotions in the audience. And then I had been writing about transitional justice, but it started to strike me it would be really good to talk about what can you do when you find yourself like actually in the midst of a really difficult situation. And I started working on film, and it came together when I thought, well, film has this amazing capacity to convey lived experience. And so that you can really sort of live alongside the characters, and that it can show sort of everyday resistance as a kind of a way of life. And also the other thing I thought, perhaps this is in the back of my mind, but the kind of resistance that I was writing about, is kind of resistance that's relevant to everyone, no matter what kind of a society that you're living in. Yeah, so it's a lot of things coming together.
So how long has this book been
in the works? It's been a while. As I told you before, there's only 2 times now, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and definitely started before the pandemic, but I was working on it very gradually, very slowly, because I spent a lot of time working with the one film and just like watching it over and over and over again and sort of analysing it really closely. And so each film that I worked on took like a really long time to work on, and then putting it together took a really long time as well. So it's been a long gestation. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. It's a book about everyday resistance. Obviously, as in any academic field, there's a huge problem with definitions. No one agrees about the definitions of anything. So I was wondering if, to set the stage for the discussion tonight, you give us a bit your definition about nonviolence, resistance, everyday resistance, and maybe a bit of the conceptual power you bring to this.
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things about this, I sort of had an idea in my mind of what I thought resistance was and what nonviolent resistance was, and all the things I was reading sort of weren't talking about that, in my view. So they were talking about it in a very kind of mechanistic way, as thinking that you know, power is kind of like a force, and then resistance is an opposition to that. And so they were just thinking of this kind of back and forth between sort of power and resistance. And so I did a lot of reading around, and I was very unhappy with it all, until a friend had recommended to me a long time ago Václav Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless. And then when I read that, I thought, that is it, that it's exactly what I was looking for all along, that his concept of that resistance, in a sense, isn't this kind of dissidence or dissent against, but it's really about looking for things that have intrinsic value, and that the kind of resistance that you engage in has to have a kind of an integrity, and it has to be ethical. So that was like incredibly inspiring for me. And I was also really interested in Lisa Tessman wrote this book called Burden Virtues. And it's about that when you're in situations of oppression, what can happen is that in order to try to resist the oppression, you will have to do things that you yourself don't think are right. Essentially, like violence will be one example, but she also talked about things like anger and rage, or telling lies. And she sort of distinguished between two sort of forms of resistance. One, which would be that you would do anything to achieve the goal that you wanted to achieve, and that included violence. And then the other idea was that whatever you did had to be kind of in accordance with the goal that you wanted to achieve. And she used two different examples. She used Malcolm X for the first and Martin Luther King for the second. And for me, that really articulated part of what I was really interested in, that you want to be able to resist in such a way that you're still sort of upholding your values in doing that. And then with nonviolence, I also found that some of the ways that nonviolence was defined were problematic, in that they still, even the way they conceived of nonviolence was with all kinds of sort of force and threats involved in it as well. And I do think there is a sense in which even like the most extreme sort of nonviolence, which doesn't involve physical violence, like say the Gandhian view or something like that, but it's still an attempt to use force. Like it's still trying to hold something over someone, like going on a hunger strike is still a kind of a violence, in that it's a threat. It's saying, you know, if you don't do what I want, then I'm going to start myself. And so what I wanted to conceive was a sense of nonviolence that went beyond that. And so it wasn't just expressive, but that it was able to kind of be ethical and still sort of, again, live according to your own values in doing that. Yeah, so I guess I stretched all the definitions of those concepts.
Nobody's complaining about that.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about truth in your approach? Because that's central to the book.
Yeah, that's right. So it really that goes back to the Václav Havel. And so I sort of see a line of philosophical thought really tracing, I mean, you could trace it right through the whole history of philosophy, but most directly from Søren Kierkegaard's work and his idea of kind of authenticity and living in the truth. And he thought of it as very much as a kind of like an individual virtue, that someone lives according to their own truth, even if it's sort of, you know, different from everybody else's. And I think that Havel retains an element of that Kierkegaardian idea, but he also links it more to kind of sociality and thinking that you have to have connections with other people. So being true to yourself isn't just being true to yourself as an individual. So it's a kind of authenticity that's also linked to caring about others and how your actions have an effect on them too. Yeah.
Great. Wonderful segue for my next question, which is the focus on the individual, which is a focus of your book. You know, you look at films, and, you know, some of them have main protagonists, certainly a handful of main protagonists at the most, kind of thing. And so a lot of these films center on, you know, very intimate lives of individuals. Is that something that is a product of the medium of film? as a medium that allows for the investigation of sort of the intimate lives of, singular protagonists? Or is that a feature of everyday resistance? You're talking about subjective truth as being a driver of this. So can everyday resistance be collective, or?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. All your questions are great, of course.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think it's really interesting. Like, partly I turn to film because I think that what film can do, it can really convey that sense of lived experience. And then kind of necessity, films do need to focus on sort of either one character or a small number of characters. So they can't, unless they get really sort of long and messy. Like No, for example, Pablo Larraín said he originally made a 4.5-hour version of that film, but then sort of cut it down so that it would be more watchable. And so, got rid of a lot of the kind of background in order to do that. But because of that, I think it can really convey really closely those experiences and what people are going through. But the other thing I think that is important that I tried to stress is that a lot of the kinds of resistance that I'm talking about, and I should say maybe what some of them are, like seeking the truth, telling the truth, or resistance through love and duty, or resistance through cultivating happiness, or through desire, through care for others. All of them might be experienced by individuals, but they can also be a really common experience as well. So in certain sorts of societies, you might be having an experience that everyone else is having, or a lot of other people are having, but you can't talk about it because the situation is so repressive. But nevertheless, that kind of common experience can be like the grounds for a collective experience, and so can be really ultimately kind of impactful. And so I'll just give an example of that, but with a number of the countries that I talk about. East Germany, with the film Barbara, is probably the most obvious one. She ends up, I'm going to ruin the film, she ends up staying in East Germany. But for a lot of people who just use leaving East Germany as a way of kind of protesting, if you like, against the regime, and that can be really kind of effective in a way. And then Iran is a sort of a more complex situation, but yeah, simply by leaving, people can have a big impact. But each person might make that decision as an individual that they want to leave, but ultimately the effect is kind of communal and collective. So that's what I think. In No, there's probably more of a coming together, because it's like that groundswell of support for the advertising campaign and the no vote and things like that. Yeah, so there's slightly different inflections.
So it almost sounds like, this ties back to, films that portray resistance, but also enact it. If the films engage with sort of this common experience that people are having in these contexts, is it important also that maybe the films or other media are viewed within this context? Or say if we watch Barbara, what does it tell us about?
Yeah. Actually, your question about that was really helpful too, because one of the things in choosing the films is that I wanted them to be films that people would want to see, because I don't think there's much point in a way in writing about something like this unless they're films, and they're not that easy to get, but they are at least possible to get. And A Separation did win the Academy Award, for Best Foreign Film, and so and Wodster is actually on the high school curriculum in some schools in Australia. So they're relatively accessible films. They're very watchable films as well. So I think that's important. So that's part of what I do think is that a number of the films were made like specifically as activist films. So Usain Palsy made A Dry White Season specifically as an activist film, specifically to get people concerned about apartheid in South Africa. I think you can say that The Look of Silence is specifically an activist film, and so the others aren't. But then I do think then, the reception of it is really important, and that you make it because you really want people to see it and you want them to be affected by it. And so all those kind of surrounding aspects are really important too. Yeah.
Do you think this is sort of another part to that question, but do you think that your reading of resistance in these films would sort of be evident to broad audiences. I mean, the first A Dry White Season talk about the critics sort of having missed the point. And so do general audiences pick up on this sort of stuff? You said you had to watch some of the films over and over and over, so
yeah, that's true. Yeah, people might not pick it up sort of on the first viewing, or it might not be obvious, and sometimes there can be things that sort of can cloud it as well. Like I think with the Dry White Season, it was partly the way it was promoted, like the poster that they had for it that just had all the sort of Hollywood actors were most prominent in the poster, and that so that can kind of mislead people about how they read. And it's an interesting example where I think sort of over time people started to think, no, this was a really important film. Like it really did make a difference. It really did make people sit up and think about how terrible apartheid is. Yeah. So I think what I was trying to do is sort of dig deeper into the layers, but often that you don't really have to do that, you know, to be affected by the film. Yeah.
You talk about emotions a lot. You touched on it a bit earlier. It's one of your key interests, and obviously psychology. Obviously, political scientists now not acknowledge that emotions play a crucial and complex role in resistance, including Roland and his late partner Emma. So the question is no longer really if they matter, but how they matter, and also how do we study them? Because emotions are notoriously hard to study, especially for political scientists. In psychology, it's probably a different kettle of fish. But could you explain why you view emotions as central to understanding the possibilities of resistance, and how you set about actually studying them in film?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. That is linked to Havel as well, in a way that, because what Havel, I think what he brings out is the idea that positive emotions can be a really sort of powerful force, and that people say, for example, caring about their role, or I talk a lot about people caring about their families or their friends. They can all be really powerful motivators, or wanting to be happy. And there's a lot of focus on the sort of more negative emotions about hate and fear and anger, which of course can play like a really strong role and can be sort of highly motivating. But what I want to show is how these other positive emotions are really central too. And I really do it by trying to describe the lived experience as it's portrayed in the film. And of course, in a film, you're looking from the outside, if you know what I mean. You're not looking into the mind of the protagonist. So you can only sort of judge by kind of what you're being shown, like what you can see, what you can hear, the symbolism and all those kinds of things. And one of the things that I found that was really kind of freeing, and probably a better way of kind of trying to read a film, if you like, or to talk about emotions, is to allow that there are different interpretations. Like there's not only one interpretation where you say, this is how you must read the film, but rather, you know, there could be different things going on here. And so I think in a way the films are good for enabling that ambiguity. But there is also a really strong philosophical tradition of thinking about the emotions. So how we differentiate between different emotions, and what the felt experience is like, and what kind of beliefs are involved. And so there is a lot of that kind of literature to draw on. And to be honest, I use the philosophical literature much more than the psychological literature. Yeah. So not using the sort of empirical, trying to use an approach that thinks conceptually and phenomenologically and analytically about emotions. That makes sense.
Great, yeah. Also, you talk about what you call parallel structures in your book, which obviously is quite related to emotions and the way that some of these protagonists are essentially trying to make do in very oppressive systems. Do you mind talking about what parallel structures are? Because I think a great setup for some questions later.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, they're a really interesting idea. So a number of different thinkers in the Czech tradition. So Thomas Masaryk started off with this idea of small scale work. So it's a really interesting idea that in an oppressive situation, what's really important is, if possible, to be able to focus on I guess I keep thinking, coming back to the idea of the intrinsic value of what you do. So Havel actually used the example of someone who made beer, and he just really wanted to make good beer. That's what he cared about, but the regime, was trying to prevent him from doing that. And so the idea of starting from something that you think is really valuable, and it could be work, it could be something like music or having a concert or something like that. And what Havel thinks is that you start with something really small like that you take to be important. And then from that, you might be able to then create these other sort of wider kind of connections with other people. In some ways, it goes back to your individual and communal and collective, that you've got to start somewhere. So you start with this small scale work, but then from that, you might find other people that you can connect with who are also interested, say, in just listening to music, or reading books, or and through that, you get this idea of creating a parallel structure. Yeah.
So do you see everyday resistance as some other theorists in political science here as a sort of antidote to despair, or a sort of way that individuals can see that they have agency still? And do you see that as like the basis of other forms of resistance, or is this its own separate thing that isn't really connected to, protests, strikes, stuff like that?
I mean, I think that it could be just an antidote to despair in a way, if you think that you might be in a situation where you really don't know whether you could affect sort of real change. So the different regimes that I talk about are ones that some are continuing, some of where I thought that the situation actually got worse over the time I was writing. So when I first started writing about it, and when I was writing about the liticides in Indonesia, it seemed there was a real sort of historical opportunity for there to be like an apology and reparations, and I think Annie would be knowing what I'm talking about. But then that window seemed to then close again. And so I think whether it's an antidote to despair or not is going to depend very much the situation that you're in, and also where the possibilities lie. If the possibilities still could then lie in overturning a regime. But I think in some ways it's really sort of hopeful to think if people keep engaging in these, sometimes you can watch a regime just sort of collapse overnight and everyone says, how did that happen? So thinking of some of the examples we're talking about, like East Germany in particular, that happens through just like sort of everyone changing their way of thinking about things, and it just doesn't seem possible anymore. So it could have that effect. Yeah.
So anywhere from almost no effect at all to collapsing regime.
So yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's not, I guess that's maybe coming back to the earlier point I was trying to make, that it's not just saying that we want to stop this regime no matter what. That's why Havel said it's not really about being a dissident, but it's really about saying we're in this situation. So in that situation, how can we live in the truth in that situation?
I was wondering if we could talk more about one of the more interesting concepts. Every chapter is interesting in its own way, but the chapter about the film Separation, because oftentimes when we think about resistance, we kind of just see it as, the right choice to make or the good thing to do, etc. You've already touched on this, but I think that chapter really pulls out the fact that sometimes resistance itself is, complicated in terms of morality.
I think that's true. Actually, interestingly enough, that was the first one that I wrote on. So thinking about the idea, Simone de Beauvoir talks about how there is an ambiguity in everything that we do. So in our ethics, that we're often finding ourselves with these kind of moral dilemmas. And my view is that those moral dilemmas get really heightened in authoritarian and totalitarian societies. And so the way in which the two characters are both trying to think about how they can live in the truth, in a sense. And so Simone is thinking about she has to leave Iran and she has to take her daughter away from Iran. And then Nader is thinking, but his father has dementia, and so he has to stay and care for him. So they're both thinking about how they can do the right thing and how they can live in the truth, but they're really drawn in different directions, and they end up making different decisions. And obviously it's terrible as well, because it's so terrible for their daughter who has to choose between them. So in that sense, it's true that you know, the idea of everyday resistance isn't sort of a recipe. Yeah, that it can be really complicated and messy, and the outcomes could still not be good as well. Yeah, it's sort of no guarantees. It's still risky. It's still very risky. I guess that one thing actually I hadn't said, but this was important, that a lot of ways that resistance is perceived as people were sort of heroic and willing to give up everything. Whereas this idea is people who are trying to sort of, you know, keep the things that they value, to look after themselves and the people that they care about. And they're not trying to be heroes. Yeah.
I guess that kind of leads me to a question that I should have asked at the start as well. You've defined nonviolence and we've talked about resistance. How do you conceptualize the everyday qualifier?
Yeah, and I really thought about that, and like, where did I come up with that idea? And there are, I think you said it was a minor aspect of political science, and there are a couple of articles that use that term everyday resistance, and they tend to be mainly talking about sort of peasant resistance and people who can sort of in villages still be able to resist a sort of larger regime. But what I had in mind was more the idea of resistance that's kind of a way of life, and that it's lived each day. And so that it becomes something that is kind of like a practice that you engage in. And so it's not aiming at making, you know, a big impact or having a huge demonstration or something like that, but it's just something that you can do you know, iteratively. Yeah.
So does it have a ritualistic kind of dimension to it, or is it more on the fly, or?
Oh, I think, I mean, insofar as life is ritualistic, you know, if you think of like going back to Barbara, she's a doctor, and so she ends up just thinking, well, it's really important for me to stay here and care for the patients and to do the medical research and to live this life in this little village away from everywhere. And yeah, and so to just, you know, live in that way. Yeah.
Great. It's 5:30, so now we're gonna switch to the Q&A portion of the talk.